There is something very curious about the way we perceive the world. For most of our lives, we assume that reality is something completely fixed, something solid, something that simply exists out there, independent of us. The world seems to exist on its own. Situations appear to happen randomly. Circumstances seem to arise without any connection to what is happening inside our consciousness. And for a long time that explanation feels convincing, but there comes a moment in the journey of self-awareness when something begins to shift. At first, it may be very subtle, just a small question appearing in the background of the mind, a quiet doubt that begins to emerge. What if reality is not exactly what we always believed it was? What if what we call the external world is not as separate from our consciousness as we once assumed? That question alone begins to open a door, because when awareness starts to awaken, something interesting begins to happen. People begin to notice small changes in the way life unfolds. Situations that once felt rigid begin to feel more fluid. Human interactions begin to shift. Unexpected opportunities begin to appear. Certain encounters seem to happen at exactly the right moment, and sometimes answers appear right after an inner question was asked. At first it may look like coincidence, perhaps just luck, perhaps a random alignment of events. But as awareness becomes clearer and more present, it becomes harder to ignore something that keeps repeating. Reality seems to respond, and that realization can be deeply transformative, because it changes the way we understand life itself. If reality were completely fixed and entirely separate from us, then everything would exist beyond our influence. We would simply be passive observers in a world that unfolds on its own. But the experience of many people who have begun observing their own consciousness reveals something different. They start noticing that the way they perceive reality begins influencing the way reality appears. This does not mean the mind is controlling everything. It does not mean isolated thoughts magically create events. But something much deeper seems to be happening. Something related to the way consciousness perceives, interprets, and interacts with what we call reality. Think about this for a moment. How many times have you seen two people experience the exact same situation in completely different ways? The same conversation can be interpreted in opposite ways. The same opportunity can feel like a risk for one person, and like an open door for someone else. The same event can create fear in one mind, and curiosity in another. The external event remains the same, but the experience of reality becomes completely different. This reveals something very important. Reality is not only what happens, it is also deeply influenced by how we perceive what happens. In that sense, consciousness acts like a lens, and that lens shapes the way the world appears to us. When the mind is filled with fear, the world appears full of threats. When the mind is filled with anxiety, the future appears uncertain and heavy. When the mind is filled with judgment, people appear hostile or distant. But when awareness becomes more present, something very interesting begins to happen. The lens starts to change, and when the lens changes, the reality that appears begins to change as well. Not because the external world suddenly transformed, but because the way you relate to it has changed. And that inner shift begins to create very real effects. Conversations become more open, decisions become clearer, actions become more aligned, and slowly, life begins responding in different ways. It is almost as if reality is constantly interacting with the state of your consciousness, and when you start noticing that, a deeper question naturally emerges. If awareness influences the way reality appears, then to what extent is the way you perceive life shaping the experience you live? That question is far more profound than it seems, because it invites us to look at something we rarely question, the state of our own consciousness. For many years, most people try to change their lives by changing external circumstances. A new job, a new city, new relationships, new achievements. But very often, even when the external scenario changes, the internal experience remains exactly the same, and that happens because the lens of consciousness did not change. But when awareness begins to deepen, when we start observing thoughts instead of identifying with them, when we begin noticing emotions without being completely carried away by them, something begins to shift. The way we perceive the world transforms. And when that transformation happens, reality begins responding in unexpected ways. But this raises a fascinating question. If awareness can change the way reality appears, then how exactly does this interaction happen? Does reality truly respond to the inner state of consciousness? Or are we simply changing the way we perceive what is already happening? That is exactly what we are going to begin exploring, because when we start investigating this relationship between awareness and reality, we discover something that can completely transform the way we understand life itself. But to truly understand this, we first need to look more deeply at something we almost never question. the way the mind constructs the experience of reality, and that is exactly what we will explore next. There is something we rarely notice about the way we experience reality. We tend to believe that we see the world exactly as it is. We assume that what appears in front of us is simply a direct reflection of what is happening out there. But when we begin observing the mind more carefully, a curious discovery begins to emerge. We realize that we do not experience reality directly. We experience an interpretation of reality. Between what happens in the world and what we perceive, there is a silent process taking place inside the mind. That process creates meaning. It interprets situations. It decides what is important. It decides what should be ignored. It creates narratives. And most of the time, we do all of this automatically, without noticing. Think about something simple for a moment. Imagine two people entering the same room. Both are present in the same environment. Both see the same people. Both hear the same conversations. Yet their internal experience may be completely different. One person might feel curiosity, openness, and interest. The other might feel discomfort, insecurity, or judgment. The environment is the same, but the reality each person experiences is completely different. This happens because the mind does not simply observe the world. It interprets the world. It selects parts of the experience. It amplifies certain details. It ignores others. And slowly it constructs a version of reality that feels absolutely true. But that version is not necessarily reality itself. It is a construction of the mind. This is a crucial realization in the journey of awakening, because once we begin to see this clearly, something profound shifts. We start realizing that what we have always called reality may actually be filtered through invisible layers of interpretation, beliefs, memories, past experiences, fears, expectations. All of these shape the way we perceive the world. Imagine someone who spent years believing they are not good enough. When that person enters a new situation, the mind automatically begins searching for signs that confirm that belief. A moment of silence in a conversation may feel like rejection. A neutral comment may feel like criticism. A distracted look may feel like judgment. The external reality may be neutral, but the internal experience becomes charged with meaning. Now imagine the opposite. A person who has developed a more open perception of life. A mind that is more present. A consciousness that observes thoughts without fully identifying with them. That person may enter the same situation and perceive something entirely different. Curiosity, possibility, connection. The external event remains the same, but the experience of reality becomes completely different. This reveals something very profound. The reality we experience is not only what happens, it is also the result of how consciousness interprets what happens. And when we begin to see this clearly, something very liberating occurs. We begin to realize that we may not be completely imprisoned by external circumstances. There may be a space of freedom in the way we relate to what appears in life. That space begins to emerge when awareness becomes more present. When we begin observing the mind instead of automatically following every thought. When we start noticing emotions without being completely absorbed by them. When we become aware of the internal patterns that previously operated unconsciously, at that moment, something new begins to happen. The lens of consciousness starts changing. And when that lens changes, something fascinating occurs. Reality begins to appear differently. Situations that once seemed threatening begin to appear as challenges. Conversations that once created conflict begin to become opportunities for understanding. Decisions that once seemed confusing begin to become clearer, and slowly we begin to notice something surprising. When we change the way we perceive the world begins to respond differently. This does not mean we are controlling reality, but it means we are changing the way we participate in it, and that participation transforms the entire experience of life. But something even deeper is happening here. Because when consciousness begins observing the mind, another discovery begins to emerge. We realize that perhaps we are not exactly what we always believed ourselves to be. Perhaps we are not merely the thoughts appearing in the mind. Perhaps we are not merely the emotions arising in the body. Perhaps there is something deeper observing all of this. A silent presence, a consciousness that perceives thoughts. A consciousness that perceives emotions. A consciousness that perceives the experience of life itself. And when that awareness begins to awaken, the relationship with reality begins to change in ways few people imagine. But this leads to a very important question. If the mind interprets reality, and if awareness can observe that interpretation, then who is actually perceiving the world? This question may appear simple, but when we explore it deeply, it reveals something that can transform the way we understand the experience of life itself. And that is exactly what we will begin exploring next. There is a very particular moment in the process of awakening when something begins to become clearer. It is a quiet moment. Nothing dramatic needs to happen externally. No grand revelation needs to appear, yet something changes in the way you observe your own experience. You begin to notice that reality is not only happening outside of you, it is also happening through the way you perceive it. And when that perception begins to deepen, something fascinating starts to unfold. You begin to see your thoughts as events. Before this realization, most people live completely immersed inside the mind. Every thought feels absolutely true. Every interpretation appears to be a direct reflection of reality. Every emotion feels like an unavoidable response to what is happening. But when awareness becomes more present, a small distance begins to appear. You still perceive the thoughts, but now you also notice that they are simply thoughts. They appear. They tell stories. They interpret the world, but they are not necessarily reality itself. This small shift may seem subtle, but it has a powerful impact, because when you stop identifying completely with every thought that appears, something important begins to happen. The way you react to life begins to change. Before, a thought would appear and immediately trigger a reaction. If the mind said, "This is a problem," the body would tense up. If the mind said, "This is dangerous," the nervous system would respond with fear. If the mind said, "This will not work," your internal energy would contract. But when you begin observing thoughts instead of automatically believing them, a space begins to emerge. And that space is extremely important, because inside that space there is freedom. Freedom to notice a thought without immediately reacting to it. Freedom to observe an emotion without being completely carried away by it. Freedom to choose a different response. And when this freedom begins appearing in your experience, something very interesting begins to happen. The way you participate in reality starts to change. Before, your experience of life was almost entirely guided by automatic reactions, old patterns, past memories, unconscious beliefs. But when awareness becomes more present, those patterns begin to lose their power, not because they disappear immediately, but because now they are being seen. And whatever is seen by awareness no longer holds the same unconscious control. Think about something very simple. Imagine someone says something that would normally make you feel irritated. Before, the reaction would be immediate. The mind would interpret the comment as a threat. The emotion would arise. The reaction would follow. Perhaps a defensive reply, perhaps silence filled with tension. But when awareness is present, something different happens. The comment is still heard. The thought still appears. The emotion may still arise. But there is a moment of awareness before the reaction. And inside that moment, everything can change. You may notice that the interpretation is simply a story created by the mind. You may realize that the other person may not have meant what your mind assumed. You may see that reacting automatically would only reinforce an old pattern. And in that moment, a new possibility appears. The possibility of responding instead of reacting. This difference may seem small, but it transforms the entire experience of reality. Because every conscious response changes the direction of experience. Every moment of presence changes the way situations unfold. And gradually, something fascinating begins to happen. Reality starts responding differently. Relationships begin to shift. Conversations begin to flow in new ways. Decisions begin to arise with greater clarity. And the most interesting part is that these changes are often almost invisible at first, but over time they accumulate. And when you look back, you may realize that life has transformed in significant ways. But this raises a very profound question. If awareness can create this space between thought and reaction, then how much of the way we live today is truly conscious choice? And how much is simply the repetition of old mental patterns? This question may feel uncomfortable, but it can also be incredibly liberating, because when we begin to see the unconscious patterns guiding our reactions, something new becomes possible. Awareness begins participating in the experience of life, and when awareness participates, reality begins to respond. But there is something even deeper happening behind all of this, because when awareness becomes sufficiently present, a surprising realization begins to emerge. Perhaps you are not only someone reacting to reality, perhaps you are also participating in the way reality unfolds. But this leads to an even more intriguing question. If awareness influences the way reality manifests, then what exactly is the role of consciousness in the experience of life? And to what extent is the reality you perceive shaped by the state of your own awareness? That is exactly what we will begin exploring in the next part. There is a point in the journey of awareness when something very subtle begins to reveal itself. Something that has always been present, yet rarely observed clearly. The way reality organizes itself around us appears to be deeply connected to the inner state of our consciousness. At first, this idea may seem abstract. It may sound like a philosophical reflection, but when we begin observing our own experience carefully, something interesting begins to appear. Certain patterns begin to repeat. Perhaps you have experienced something like this before. You shift internally, and not long after, something in the external world begins responding differently. It is not magical, it is not immediate, but there is a kind of silent alignment that begins to emerge. Relationships that once felt tense begin to soften. Conversations that once ended in conflict begin to flow with more understanding. Decisions that once felt confusing begin to become clearer. And often these changes happen without you directly trying to control the situation. What changed was the state of awareness. This happens because human reality is not merely a sequence of external events. It is also deeply influenced by how we participate in those events. And that participation happens through consciousness. When the mind is trapped in fear, judgment, or resistance, the way we react to the world creates certain dynamics. Those dynamics influence our actions, they influence our words, they influence our choices, and those choices ultimately shape the outcomes that appear in our lives. But when awareness becomes more present, something changes in the way we participate in those situations. Before, we reacted automatically, now we begin responding with greater clarity. Before, we interpreted everything through old patterns, now we begin seeing each situation with more openness. Before, we tried to control the outcomes, now we begin noticing the natural flow of circumstances, and this internal shift has a very real impact, because every conscious choice alters the direction of experience. Every moment of presence creates a new possibility of action, and slowly these small changes begin to accumulate. The result is that reality begins to appear different, not because the world magically changed, but because the way you participate in reality changed. Imagine someone who constantly expects rejection. That expectation influences how they speak, how they position themselves, how they interpret the behavior of others. Even neutral situations may be interpreted as rejection. That interpretation creates tension. That tension influences behavior, and that behavior often ends up producing the exact kind of response that confirms the original belief. Now imagine the opposite, a more present awareness. A mind less dominated by automatic narratives. That person enters the same situation with openness. They observe, they listen, they respond with clarity. And very often the outcome becomes completely different. The same external situation can generate entirely different experiences depending on the state of awareness. This does not mean we control every event in life, but it does mean that we participate deeply in the way reality unfolds within our experience. And when this understanding begins to become clear, something important shifts inside us. We begin to realize that the transformation of reality does not start outside. It begins in consciousness. It begins in the way we perceive, the way we respond, the way we choose to act. And slowly we begin to perceive something even deeper. Perhaps reality is not only happening to us, perhaps it is also happening through us. This possibility completely transforms the way we relate to life. Because when awareness awakens, we begin to notice that every moment contains an invisible choice. The choice between reacting unconsciously or responding with presence. And that silent choice can completely alter the direction of experience. But this leads to an even more fascinating question. If awareness influences the way reality organizes itself within our experience, then what actually happens when awareness becomes deeply present? How does reality begin to respond when the mind is no longer dominated by fear, judgment, or resistance? That is exactly what we will explore in the next part. When we begin observing the relationship between awareness and reality more deeply, something even more interesting begins to reveal itself. We start realizing that the way we experience life does not depend only on what happens. It depends largely on the quality of awareness with which we are present in each moment. This realization may seem simple, but its implications are profound, because it shows us that the reality we experience is far more dynamic than we once imagined. It is not merely a fixed sequence of events, it is constantly interacting with the way we perceive, interpret, and respond to each situation. Imagine two different moments in your own life. In one of them, you may have been overwhelmed by worry, anxiety, or fear. In another moment, you may have felt calm, present, and clear. Now think about how the same situations can feel completely different depending on those internal states. When the mind is agitated, the world feels heavier, problems appear larger, decisions feel more difficult, human interactions feel more tense. But when awareness becomes more present, something changes immediately. The same situation may appear simpler, the same decision may feel clearer, the same conversation may flow more easily. Externally, nothing changed. yet the experience of reality changed. This reveals something extremely important. The reality we experience is not only what happens, it is also deeply influenced by the internal state of our awareness. When we are unconscious of our own mental patterns, we react to life automatically. Thoughts create interpretations, interpretations create emotions, emotions create reactions, and those reactions reinforce the same patterns of experience. It is almost as if we are living inside an invisible cycle, a cycle where the mind interprets reality, reacts to that interpretation, and then reinforces the narrative it created. But when awareness begins to awaken, that cycle becomes visible, and whatever becomes visible to awareness begins losing its automatic power. At that moment, something very interesting happens. Reality stops appearing as an inevitable sequence of events. It begins to appear as a field of possibilities. Every situation stops being merely a trigger for automatic reactions. Instead, it becomes an opportunity to respond consciously. This shift is far more powerful than it may initially seem, because every conscious response alters the direction of experience. Every moment of presence changes how events unfold. Every choice made with clarity creates new possibilities. And slowly something surprising begins to happen. Life starts flowing differently. Many people describe this as if reality itself begins to respond, not in a magical or supernatural way, but in a natural and almost organic way. When you become more present, your actions become more aligned. When your actions become more aligned, your choices become clearer. When your choices become clearer, the paths that open in front of you begin to change. And this sequence creates something very powerful, a new relationship with life. You stop living merely reacting to what happens, and you begin living as a conscious participant in the experience. This shift transforms the way we see reality. Before, life seemed to be simply happening to us. Now we begin realizing that we are participating in the way it unfolds. But this realization raises a fascinating question. If awareness can transform the way we participate in reality, then to what extent is what we call external reality truly separate from the awareness perceiving it? This question takes us into an even deeper territory, because perhaps the relationship between awareness and reality is far more intimate than we imagine. Perhaps awareness is not merely observing the world. Perhaps it is also part of the way the world appears. And if that is true, then the way we cultivate awareness may have a far greater impact on our experience of life than we realize. But this brings us to the final point of this reflection, because when we begin realizing that awareness influences how reality appears, a new responsibility emerges. The responsibility of observing the state of our own consciousness, of noticing internal patterns, of noticing the thoughts shaping the way we see the world, and most importantly, of recognizing that every moment contains a silent choice, the choice to remain unconscious, or to live with awareness. And that choice has the power to transform the entire experience of reality. But there is still something essential to understand, because when awareness becomes truly present, something even deeper begins to happen. Something that changes not only how we perceive reality, but also how reality seems to respond to our presence. And that is exactly what we will explore in the final part. Something very interesting begins to happen when awareness becomes more present in our experience. At the beginning of the journey, it may feel as if we are simply learning to observe our thoughts, learning to react less, learning to live with a little more calm. But as time passes, we begin to realize that something much deeper is unfolding. We are not only changing how we react to reality, we are changing how we participate in it. And that difference is fundamental, because for most of our lives, we live as if we are separate from reality, as if life is something external that simply happens to us. Events arise, situations appear, and we respond to them the best we can. But when awareness begins to awaken, something quietly shifts. We begin to notice that the way we are present deeply influences how we experience the world. The same situation can feel completely different depending on the state of awareness. A conversation can transform depending on the quality of attention we bring to it. A decision can become clearer when the mind is no longer dominated by internal noise, and a difficult situation can reveal unexpected possibilities when we stop reacting automatically. Slowly we begin realizing that reality is not only something happening outside, it is also shaped by how we are present within. And when this understanding begins to mature, a new relationship with life starts to emerge. Instead of trying to control every detail of the future, we begin paying more attention to the present moment. Instead of reacting immediately to every thought, we begin observing before acting. Instead of living inside endless mental narratives, we begin directly experiencing what is happening now. And within that space of presence, something very subtle begins to appear. something many people describe as a form of silent intelligence, a sense of inner direction, a clarity that does not come from thought, but from awareness itself. Sometimes it appears as a feeling of alignment, sometimes it appears as a quiet inner knowing, and sometimes it appears as a clear intuition about which path to follow. But this guidance does not appear when the mind is filled with noise. It appears when there is space, when there is presence, when there is enough inner silence for something deeper to be perceived. And this reveals something very important. Perhaps awareness is not merely observing reality. Perhaps it is also deeply connected to the intelligence that moves life itself. Perhaps there is a form of silent wisdom within consciousness, a wisdom that does not require effort to appear. It only requires space, space of presence, space of silence, space of attention. And when we begin perceiving this dimension, something beautiful begins to unfold. Life stops feeling like a chaotic sequence of events. It begins to feel like a living process, a process where every moment contains subtle hints, silent directions, small signals pointing toward more aligned paths. But this raises an important question. How can we recognize these signs? Why do many people begin noticing strange coincidences, meaningful encounters, and patterns appearing in life after awakening? That is exactly what we will explore in the next video. Why synchronicities start appearing after awakening. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.